The southern coast of England in the late spring of 1944 was a coiled spring, a weapon pointed directly at the coast of France. It was the most immense concentration of military power the world had ever seen. Fields were packed with rows of Sherman tanks. Harbors were choked with landing craft. Every road, every lane, every village green was a parking lot for men, machines, and the staggering logistics of an invasion. This was Operation Overlord. Its success, and the fate of the free world, hinged on a single, immutable factor over which no general, no soldier, no tank had any control: the weather. The plan was a house of cards, vulnerable to a single gust of wind. The airborne landings needed a late rising moon for concealment but enough light for pilots to navigate. The naval armada required calm seas to cross the channel and for small landing craft to ferry troops to the beaches. The Air Force needed clear skies to bomb coastal defenses. And the ground forces needed firm, dry ground after landing, not the quagmire that would follow heavy rain. A narrow, almost non-existent window of perfect conditions was required. The date was set, June 5, 1944. But as the final days of May bled away, the weather over the North Atlantic began to tell a different story. In a secret underground bunker at Southwick House, north of Portsmouth, the Supreme Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, faced an agonizing decision. Postponement meant holding millions of men at a peak of readiness, a logistical nightmare with a high risk of the entire plan being discovered by the enemy. Going ahead in bad weather meant catastrophe. His decision would be based entirely on the predictions of his chief meteorologist, a dour, chain-smoking Scot named Group Captain James Stagg. Stagg led a small, secret team of the best Allied forecasters, but their science was more art than certainty. They relied on sparse data from a few weather ships and clandestine reports from neutral Ireland. Their maps were a chaotic tapestry of isobars and frontal systems, a language of impending storms and fleeting highs. In the final week of May, the picture they painted was grim. A persistent low-pressure system was stewing over the Atlantic, its tendrils reaching towards the Channel. The forecasts for June 5 were unanimously terrible: high winds, thick cloud cover, and rough seas. It was the worst possible news. Eisenhower's face was etched with the weight of the decision. To send these men into a storm was to send them to their deaths before they even saw the enemy. But the clock was ticking. The tides were right. The secret couldn't be kept forever. Across the Channel, the German High Command was watching the same weather. Their chief meteorologist, Professor Carl Sonntag, operating with even less data than the Allies, delivered a similar, if not more definitive, forecast. He assured the German command that the persistent bad weather made a large-scale amphibious invasion in the first week of June utterly impossible. The Channel, he stated, was a natural defensive barrier, churned into a fury by the Atlantic lows. The commander of the German forces in Normandy, the legendary Erwin Rommel, so confident in this assessment, used it as an opportunity. He left his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon on June 4 to travel to Germany. His mission: to personally petition Hitler for more panzer divisions. He also intended to celebrate his wife's birthday. To the Germans, the weather was their unwitting ally, granting them a precious respite. For Eisenhower, it was a sword hanging over the entire operation. The stage was set for one of the greatest gambles in military history, a decision that would rest not on the strength of armies, but on the interpretation of wind and cloud. And in this high-stakes game, James Stagg was about to see something in the data that everyone else had missed. Group Captain James Stagg was not a man built for diplomacy. Tall, stern, and plagued by a chronic stomach ulcer, he was a scientist to his core, precise, cautious, and uncomfortable with the immense pressure now placed upon him. His domain was not the battlefield, but the chaotic, fluid atmosphere. He understood its language, the falling barometer that signaled an approaching low, the shift in wind direction that hinted at a passing front. His team was a triumvirate of Allied talent, America's irrepressible Captain Franklin Doc Crick, a proponent of analog forecasting who believed weather patterns repeated themselves, and Britain's Dr. Sverre Pedersen, a brilliant but pessimistic Norwegian who trusted only complex physical models. The two men often clashed, their conflicting predictions adding to Stagg's burden. He was the arbiter, the man who had to synthesize their work, find the consensus, and deliver a single, unequivocal forecast to the most powerful man in the Allied command. The data they had was terrifyingly incomplete. The war had swept away the normal network of civilian weather stations. They relied on a handful of brave crews on weather ships stationed in the violent North Atlantic, who radioed back observations at great risk. They decoded reports from neutral countries, each one a piece of a puzzle with most of the pieces missing. The process was a relentless, 24-hour cycle of plotting charts, analyzing pressure gradients, and making educated guesses. On June 3, the consensus was bleak. All models pointed to a severe storm hitting the channel on June 5, winds of force 5 to 6, low clouds, high waves. It was an invasion killer. Stagg delivered the news to Eisenhower at 9:30 p.m. that night. The atmosphere in the library at Southwick House was funereal. The decision was made, a 24-hour postponement. The vast, intricate machine of Overlord ground to a hesitant halt. Convoys already at sea were recalled. Millions of men were left waiting, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. That night, Stagg did not sleep. He pored over the charts, his ashtray overflowing. And in the early hours of June 4, he saw it. A flicker of hope, so faint it was almost invisible. A latest report from a weather ship at station, codenamed Pluto, showed a tiny, almost insignificant rise in barometric pressure. It was a data point that contradicted the prevailing model. Crick, using his analog method, pointed to a similar pattern from 1900 that suggested a brief break in the weather. Pedersen dismissed it as an anomaly, a statistical ghost. But Stagg's intuition, honed by decades of staring at the sky, told him otherwise. He began to formulate a new, heretical theory. What if the dominant low-pressure system was moving faster and tracking further north than anyone predicted? What if a weak ridge of high pressure was building behind it, offering a temporary, fragile window of acceptable weather on the morning of June 6? It wasn't the perfect weather they had hoped for. It would be marginal, risky. The seas would still be choppy, the clouds would still be low. But it might just be enough. To present this to Eisenhower was to risk everything. If he was wrong, he would be advising the general to launch the invasion on a faulty forecast, potentially sending thousands to their deaths in a storm. The weight of that responsibility was a physical pain in his gut. But the alternative, a prolonged postponement that could unravel the entire operation, was unthinkable. On the morning of June 4, with the skies outside Southwick House already darkening with the approaching storm, James Stagg prepared to deliver the most important and controversial forecast of his life. The library at Southwick House on the morning of June 4 was thick with smoke and tension. The storm that Stagg had predicted was now raging outside, lashing the windows with rain, a visceral confirmation of the previous day's accurate forecast. It gave his words immense credibility, but what he was about to say next would test it to the limit. Eisenhower, surrounded by his commanders, Montgomery, Tedder, Lee Mallory, and Ramsey, fixed his gaze on the tall, pale Scot. Stagg stood before them, the storm providing a dramatic soundtrack to his briefing. He did not mince words. He described the complex dance of atmospheric pressure over the North Atlantic. He explained his theory: the storm currently battering England would pass through more quickly than anticipated. In its wake, a brief ridge of high pressure would build, providing a temporary lull. The weather for June 6 would not be good. It would be, in his carefully chosen word, usable. He predicted winds would moderate to force 4, cloud cover would be broken, with a base of around 1,000 feet, and there would be periods of acceptable visibility. The seas would remain rough, but manageable. This window, he stressed, would be short. Perhaps 36 hours at most, before the next system moved in. The reaction in the room was one of profound skepticism. Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory, responsible for the air cover, was horrified. The cloud cover was still too low for his bombers to accurately hit their targets. Admiral Ramsey feared for his small landing craft in the choppy seas. The risks were enormous. They were being asked to bet the entire invasion on a meteorological fluke, a faulty forecast that went against the more pessimistic, and seemingly safer, consensus. Eisenhower paced the room, his hands clasped behind his back. He was a man who understood logistics and air power. He knew what marginal weather meant: paratroopers scattered by cloud, bombers missing their targets, seasick soldiers arriving on beaches too exhausted to fight. He turned to Stagg. "What is the probability your forecast is correct?" Stagg, a scientist to the end, refused to give a percentage. "It is the most likely scenario based on the latest data, sir," he replied, his voice steady. The silence that followed was broken only by the howling wind outside. It was a stark reminder of the consequences of being wrong. At that very moment, in Paris, the German High Command was receiving its own weather briefing. Professor Sontag, with less data from the Atlantic, was unequivocal. The storm conditions would persist for days. An invasion was impossible. The commander of the 7th Army in Normandy, General Friedrich Dahlmann, was so confident that he saw no need to maintain a high state of alert. He even scheduled a map exercise for the morning of June 6 in Rennes, ordering his key division and regimental commanders to attend. The German army in Normandy was, at that moment, being deliberately stood down, lulled into a false sense of security by the very storm that was causing Eisenhower such anguish. Back at Southwick House, the clock was ticking. The invasion fleet had to sail that evening to hit the June 6 deadline. Eisenhower stopped his pacing. He looked at his commanders. Their faces were grim. The decision was his alone. He weighed the impossible options. As the Allied armada churned its way across the turbulent channel on the night of June 5, a profound and catastrophic complacency had settled over the German defenses in Normandy. The German High Command's faith in their own meteorological assessment was absolute. The logic seemed unassailable. The storm that had raged on the 4th was proof of the forecast's accuracy. The idea that the Allies would attempt a complex, multi-force invasion in such marginal conditions was, to the German mind, a tactical absurdity. In Paris, at the headquarters of Commander-in-Chief West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt received the same pessimistic weather reports. His staff agreed with the assessment from Berlin: no invasion for at least the next several days. This belief dictated their every action. Rommel, the energetic architect of the coastal defenses, was absent, confident that the weather granted him a safe window to travel. His departure was a symbolic gesture of the Germans' collective sigh of relief. Along the Atlantic wall, the rank and file mirrored this complacency. Patrols were reduced. Sentries peered out into the storm-lashed darkness, seeing only the bad weather, not the threat it concealed. Many junior officers were granted leave. The powerful German radar stations along the French coast, which should have been the eyes of the defense, were partially blinded. A massive Allied jamming operation, codenamed Window, filled their screens with static, but the storm itself provided a psychological justification for the interference. "It is the weather causing the disturbance," was the common assumption. The critical naval patrols in the Channel were cancelled due to the high seas. The Luftwaffe's reconnaissance flights were grounded. The entire German military apparatus in Normandy was effectively switched to standby mode, lulled into a false sense of security by the very conditions the Allies were desperately exploiting. The most devastating consequence of this was the reaction to the first, fragmentary reports of enemy activity. In the early hours of June 6, as Pathfinder planes and paratroopers began to drop over the Cotentin Peninsula, scattered reports trickled into German headquarters. A junior officer reported parachute sightings near Saint-Mire-Église. Another sent a panicked message about gliders landing near the Orne River Bridge. But the High Command, operating under the ironclad certainty that an invasion was impossible, dismissed them. They were classified as isolated actions, perhaps a supply drop to the French resistance, or a diversionary raid. The idea that this was the main event was rejected out of hand. The weather forecast had created a cognitive blockade in the German command structure. They were prisoners of their own assumptions. When the commander of the elite 21st Panzer Division requested permission to counterattack the British paratroopers east of the Orne, the request had to go all the way to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. The response was delayed for critical hours. The Germans had planned for every contingency on the beaches, but they had never planned for the Allies to arrive in a weather window they themselves had deemed non-existent. The faulty Allied forecast had, in effect, created a perfect tactical deception. It wasn't that the Germans were lazy or stupid, they were rationally following the evidence as they saw it. And the evidence, dawn on June 6, 1944, did not break with cinematic clarity. It arrived as a dull, wet, and gloomy twilight over the Normandy coast. The sky was a low ceiling of ragged clouds, exactly as Group Captain Stagg had foretold. The wind whipped across the water, churning the sea into a choppy, menacing gray. For the thousands of seasick, terrified soldiers crammed into the landing craft, this was hell. The conditions were brutal, far from ideal. But they were, as Stagg had promised, usable. The reality on the ground and in the air was a direct consequence of that marginal forecast. For the Allied air forces, the cloud cover was a severe handicap. The massive pre-invasion bombing campaign, designed to pulverize the German beach defenses, was largely ineffective. The bombers, flying blind through the overcast, feared hitting their own troops. They delayed their drops by precious seconds, scattering their payloads inland, missing most of their key targets. The formidable German bunkers and gun emplacements at Omaha Beach, for instance, remained largely intact. This failure in the air translated into a bloody nightmare on the ground for the American infantry. Yet, the same clouds that hampered the bombers also provided crucial concealment. The Luftwaffe, which the Germans had expected to dominate the skies, was almost entirely absent. Their planes were grounded across France, their commanders convinced no invasion was coming. The few German pilots who did scramble found themselves hopelessly outnumbered by Allied fighters that were flying, operating from closer bases and with better ground control coordination. The Allies owned the sky, not through clear weather superiority, but through sheer presence, made possible by a forecast that said they could fly. On the beaches, the rough seas caused chaos. Landing craft were swamped, tanks equipped with flotation devices, DD tanks, were launched too far out and sank in the waves, and disembarking soldiers were plunged into deep, churning water. The chaos was immense. But it was not total. The waves were high, but they were not the mountainous, ship-swallowing seas of a full Atlantic storm. The landing craft, though battered, made it to shore. The Navy, despite the conditions, performed its monumental task of delivering the army to the continent. The weather, while a formidable enemy, was not the invasion killer it would have been just 24 hours earlier. And for the German defenders, the conditions created a profound tactical confusion. The poor visibility meant they often could not see the vast scale of the invasion force until it was almost upon them. The intermittent rain and low clouds masked the movement of ships and the approach of landing craft. The paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne, though scattered far and wide by the clouds and anti-aircraft fire, used the darkness and bad weather to their advantage. Their very disorganization sowed chaos behind German lines, as the reality of the invasion crashed upon the German command structure, the consequences of their meteorological miscalculation unfolded with brutal speed. The rigid, top-heavy nature of the German army, now caught completely off guard, became a critical vulnerability. The chain of command was paralyzed by disbelief and indecision. Field Marshal von Rundstedt's headquarters in Paris, still reeling from the shock, initially classified the landings as a large-scale diversion, believing the main attack would still come at the Pas-de-Calais. This belief was reinforced by the brilliant Allied deception plan, Fortitude, but it was rooted in the original certainty that the weather made a true invasion impossible. Precious hours were wasted in debate and confusion. The absence of Erwin Rommel was a catastrophic blow. His dynamic leadership and authority were desperately needed to organize a rapid counterattack. In his place, deliberation and delay ruled. The 21st Panzer Division, positioned near Caen, was the only panzer unit capable of immediately engaging the British beaches on D-Day itself. Its commander, General Edgar Feuchtinger, recognized the threat and began moving his forces toward the coast. However, without direct orders from a high command that was still unsure if this was the real invasion, his movements were hesitant. By the time he received conflicting orders, first to counterattack, then to hold position, the opportunity to throw the British back into the sea had been lost. His tanks arrived piecemeal and were engaged by Allied anti-tank guns and fighter bombers operating from the cloudy but navigable skies. The other powerful panzer divisions, the 12th SS and the Panzer Lehr, were held in reserve by direct order from Hitler's headquarters, still fearing a phantom invasion at Calais. They spent D-Day on the roads, delayed by Allied air attacks and bureaucratic inertia, instead of on the battlefield where they were needed. The German logistical web, designed to support a static defense, began to fray under the unexpected strain. Supply depots were not on high alert. Fuel and ammunition were not prepositioned for a major counteroffensive. Communications were disrupted by French resistance sabotage and Allied bombing. The entire German military machine in Normandy was reacting, not acting. It was responding to an attack it had been assured would not come. The psychological impact on the frontline German soldier was just as devastating. They had spent months building formidable defenses, but they had also been psychologically prepared for a battle they would see coming. To be awakened in the night by the sound of naval shells, the largest bombardment in history, and to peer out at a grey dawn to see an endless armada, was a soul-shattering experience. In the days following the landings, as the world celebrated the bravery of the soldiers and the success of the invasion, the men who had made it possible returned to their silent war. For Group Captain Stagg and his team, there was no respite. The battle for Normandy raged on, and every subsequent operation, every resupply convoy, every air mission, every tactical move, required a weather forecast. The pressure did not diminish. But in the quiet moments, the full brilliance of their D-Day forecast came into focus. It wasn't a lucky guess, it was the culmination of a new, more sophisticated approach to meteorology forged in the fires of war. The Allied advantage lay in data. While the Germans were largely confined to continental Europe, the Allies had a network of weather stations stretching across the Atlantic, from Newfoundland to Iceland to the Azores. They had weather ships braving the stormy seas at designated points, radioing back vital information on pressure, wind, and temperature at different altitudes. They even had reports from a secret source. Weather stations established in Greenland and Iceland provided a crucial upstream look at the systems moving towards Europe. This vast, integrated network gave Stagg's team a panoramic view of the atmospheric battlefield. They could see the whole play, not just the final act. The German meteorologists, by contrast, were operating with blinders on. Their access to Atlantic data was limited. They relied heavily on reports from U-boats, which were vulnerable and had other priorities, and on theoretical models. Professor Sontag was a capable scientist, but he was playing a hand of poker with only half the cards. He saw the dominant low-pressure system and logically extrapolated its effects. Stagg, with more data, saw the subtle nuances, the slight acceleration of the system, the faint building of pressure behind it, that hinted at a temporary break. This was the fault in the German forecast. It was based on an incomplete picture. Furthermore, the Allied team was a fusion of different methodologies. Crick's analog approach, though sometimes dismissed as unscientific, provided a historical context that pure physics models lacked. Pedersen's complex physical models gave a rigorous, mathematical framework. Stagg's genius was in synthesizing these often conflicting viewpoints, using his own vast experience as the final arbiter. He wasn't just a forecaster, he was a conductor, orchestrating a symphony of data into a coherent prediction. The D-Day forecast was a triumph of collaboration and data sharing over isolated, centralized analysis. It proved that in the modern age, information was a weapon as potent as any. The success of the D-Day forecast did not mark an end, but a beginning. The lessons learned in the pressurized environment of Southwick House became the foundation for a new, global understanding of weather as a strategic military asset. The Allies, now fully aware of their meteorological advantage, institutionalized the practices that had given them such a critical edge. The network of weather ships and clandestine stations was expanded and formalized. Data sharing between the Allied nations became seamless, a trust forged in the knowledge that a storm over the Atlantic could dictate the success of an offensive in the Ardennes or a landing in the Pacific. This integrated approach became a key component of Allied planning for the remainder of the war. For the invasion of southern France, Operation Dragoon, forecasters used the same meticulous methods to pinpoint another landing window. In the Pacific, Admiral Nimitz's forces relied on similar long-range forecasts to plan naval engagements and island-hopping campaigns, avoiding typhoons that could decimate a fleet as effectively as the Japanese Navy. The weatherman had earned a permanent seat in the war room. For the Germans, the D-Day disaster was a brutal lesson in the cost of intellectual and informational isolation. In the aftermath, they scrambled to improve their forecasting capabilities, but it was too late. The initiative had been lost, and their resources were stretched to breaking point. The event exposed a critical weakness in their war machine, an over-reliance on rigid, centralized decision-making and a failure to appreciate the tactical value of what they considered a soft science. The psychological blow was lasting. How could they have been so utterly fooled? The answer lay not in Allied trickery, but in Allied competence, a competence born from collaboration and a willingness to listen to specialized, even contrarian, advice. The legacy of Stagg's forecast. Behind the lines of isobars and the cold precision of barometric readings lay a profound human drama. For Group Captain James Stagg, the personal toll of those early June days was immense. The chronic stomach ulcer that plagued him was a physical manifestation of the unbearable weight he carried. Every 6 hours, he had to stand before the most powerful military leaders in the Western world and, with unwavering conviction, deliver a prediction that could send hundreds of thousands to their deaths or, conversely, paralyze the war effort. There was no room for doubt in his delivery, yet his mind was a tempest of competing data and terrifying possibilities. He later confessed in his diary to moments of sheer terror, of lying awake in the brief intervals between briefings, listening to the very storm he had predicted, wondering if he had just made the gravest error of his life. His authority was hard-won. He was a scientist amidst warriors, and his weapon was a hypothesis. The tension with his own team was a constant undercurrent. The flamboyant optimism of the American, Crick, clashed with the dour pessimism of the Norwegian, Pedersen. Stagg, the dour Scot, was the perfect, if strained, intermediary. He had to absorb their conflicts, find the signal in the noise of their arguments, and present a unified front. It was a masterclass in leadership under pressure, not of command, but of consensus. For General Eisenhower, the burden was different but equally crushing. He was the ultimate decision-maker, the man who had to translate Stagg's scientific assessment into a military order. His famous, "Okay, let's go," was the culmination of a tortuous internal calculus. He was betting the future of the free world on the word of his meteorologist. The sight of the storm on the 4th must have haunted him, a visible counterargument to the faint hope Stagg was offering. In the hours after giving the order, as the fleet sailed into the uncertain darkness, Eisenhower drafted a brief note, to be released if the invasion failed. It read, "Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air and the navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. This note, a testament to his immense burden, also implicitly acknowledged that the best information available was, at its core, a weather forecast. The success of D-Day, therefore, was not just a triumph of science and logistics, but a triumph of trust. Eisenhower trusted Stagg. Stagg, in turn, trusted his data and his own synthesis of his team's work. This chain of trust, from the weather ships in the Atlantic to the Supreme Commander's desk, was as vital as any supply line. It was a human network that proved strong enough to bear the weight of history. In the end, the story of the D-Day forecast is a story of courage, not the courage of the battlefield, but the courage of conviction. It is the courage to stand by a difficult and counterintuitive conclusion when the stakes could not be higher. James Stagg did not win the war, but he made winning possible. He was the true measure of the D-Day forecast's brilliance is found not in the charts of June 5, but in the cold, hard reality of what followed. Had the invasion been launched on the 5th, as originally planned, it would have met the full, unbridled fury of the Atlantic storm. The landing craft would have been swamped, the airborne operations rendered impossible by cloud and wind, and the naval bombardment ineffective. The result would have been a catastrophic failure, a defeat so demoralizing it might have prolonged the war in Europe by years. Conversely, a postponement to the next tidal window, around June 19, would have been equally disastrous. Unbeknownst to the Allies, the period from June 19 to 22 saw the worst Channel storm in 40 years, a storm that would have devastated the invasion fleet had it been at sea or exposed on the beaches. The artificial harbors, the mulberries, which were crucial for sustaining the beachhead, were severely damaged by this very storm. A full invasion force caught in it would have been annihilated. Stagg's forecast, therefore, had identified the only possible window for success in that entire month of June. It was a sliver of opportunity, a crack in the door of fate that he alone had the perception to see and the courage to point out. This was not a faulty forecast. It was a perfect one. Its fault lay only in the eyes of the German observers, for whom such a marginal possibility did not register as a military probability. The forecast doomed the Luftwaffe and the German army not by being wrong, but by being right in a way their enemy could not comprehend. It exploited a gap in the German mindset, a reliance on perfect conditions and a failure to appreciate the power of improvisation and acceptable risk. The Allies were willing to embrace a usable forecast, the Germans were waiting for an